Hello my dear viewers, welcome to my channel. Thank you for subscribing, liking and commenting on my videos. I'm thinking to do some special episodes that are more about the modern history, what is modern as 20th century, such as World War II, Hosbach Memorandum or things like that. We're gonna see about that because I like Dark Ages, High Middle Ages, just medieval stuff more than I do later history, so we're gonna see. After the close of the 5th century, the Huns occupied the steppe region of Peninsula, or as Procopius states, of a 6th century, between Bosporus and Cherson. Everything is held by the Barbarians, the Hunnic nations. Bosporus, situated on the strait itself, also became subject to the Huns. There is no ground for the speaking, as certain scholars do, of complete destruction by the Huns of this important center, the Byzantine government protecting its own interest on the far-off borderland of the Taris, as well of those of its vassals and allies. I should mention that the book is not one-to-one translation. It's more of an artistic translation. As we can see, there is a use of word Byzantine, which didn't exist until 15th, 16th centuries. They wouldn't call themselves that. Anyway, let's get back to the text. The mountain Goths could not submit easily to the domination of the Huns in the steppes of the peninsula. According to Procopius, under Justin I, 518 to 527 AD, the Bosporites decided to become subjects of the empire. We do not know the reason for this decision, which was not carried into effect. Justin sent Probus, the nephew of the late Emperor Anastasius, with a great sum of money to Bosporus to bribe an army of Huns and send them as allies to Iberians in the Caucasus, who at the time were fighting against the Persians and badly needed Roman support. But Probus was unsuccessful in his mission and departed from Bosporus without accomplishing anything. The Huns, torn by internal strife, were not in condition to respond to emperor's requests. As a result of Justin's successor, Justinian took advantage of the Huns' internal strife, sent troops and conquered Bosporus. And since that time, as John Malaris remarks, Bosporus, occupied by the Romans, has lived in peace. In the connection with the expansion of his power in the peninsula, Justinian, however, realized that the capture of Bosporus did not settle the Hunnic problem there. Therefore, he set to work both to restore the former fortifications in the peninsula and to build new ones. He restored the walls of Cherson and built 2 new forts on the southern coast, one at Altusa, and the other at Gurozvaite. Sorry for that, I don't know how to read that name. But he took special care of Cherson, which he accordingly strongly fortified. Perhaps those scholars are right who believe the subjugation of Bosporus to the emperor in the 6th century also meant the restoration of the power of the Bosporan king, who was later, of course, a vassal of the empire. In that case, a Bosporan inscription with the name of the pious king Tiberius Julius Dipotanus, a friend of Caesar and the Romans, who erected a tower in Bosporus, may with great probability be referred to the epoch of Justinian. In addition, Justinian barred the approach of the enemies by means of long walls, so that, according to Procopius, he freed the Goths from any danger of invasion. Thus, for the 6th century, we have a fairly definite picture of the position of the Goths in Crimea. The common danger from the Huns, both to the imperial possessions in the peninsula and to the mountain Goths, forced the threatened parties to combine. The Goths became vassal allies of the empire, under obligation to furnish auxiliaries. On the other hand, Justinian pledged himself to protect his own possessions and the settlements of his allies against Hunnic attacks. Thereupon, he erected a line of forts whose terminals were Bosporus in the east and Cherson in the west, and his constructive activities were not confined to the coast, but extended into the Crimean mountains, as proved by the inscription. The book fails to mention the Avars here, who were present in Crimea. As raiders, they didn't stay for long. They only moved through Crimea, through Ukraine. I don't know what Ukraine was called at the time. I guess it was just steppe. It was the horde land. There was no name for it, so nobody cared to name it. But they moved quickly to Dacia and from there they shattered the Gepids and made the Lombards flee. So they are not present in Crimea, they are not the important players. But what it also fails to mention, that the Huns were not of those of Attila, because it gives us what year it's happening. It gives us the time that is happening, but it fails to tell us that those states, those Huns, are not of Attila, but of post-Attila states, of Diadochi states of Attila, that is his sons, minor chieftains, Kutrigers, Utigers, and of course his sons. That's what this Huns problem is referring to. But in the 70s of the 6th century, a new and serious danger to the Crimea appeared. I refer to the Turco-Khazar hordes, who were to play a considerable time an important role in the peninsula. In 575, when Tiberius was proclaimed co-emperor of Justin II, who was ill at the time, a novella was issued containing various privileges for different regions of the empire. This novella exempted the Caucasian land of Ayazi, Bosporus, and Chersonesus from the naval duty formerly imposed upon them. Hence, it is obvious that in 575 Bosporus still belonged to the empire, but in the following year, 576, circumstances changed. Through the Avars, the Byzantines first became acquainted with the Eastern Turks, as Byzantine sources sometimes call the Khazars for the Turco-Khazars, begged Justin II not to admit the Avars into the empire. In the 6th century, the Turco-Khazars, already considerable strength, and by their conquests in Caucasian steppes and Caucasus itself, menaced the Persian Sassanids. On the other side, their advance from the Caspian Sea westwards drew them nearer to the Cimmerian Bosporus and the South Russian steppes. In 576, they captured the city of Bosporus, and in 581, they were already in view of Chersonesus. A serious danger was looming over the Tauric fortified border from the north, and the Gothic possessions were also inevitably affected by the Turco-Khazarian advance. In the connection of the capture of Bosporus by the Turco-Khazars in 576 and their appearance near Chersonesus in 581, the question arises of the beginning of the Khazar predominance in Crimea, of which in later times we have positive information. Was the capture of Bosporus in 576 a transient occurrence of short duration, or from this time on May, we speak of actual Khazar domination in the peninsula? In 1896, J. Kowalski wrote, after 575 Byzantium had no power whatsoever in Cimmerian Bosporus, nor made any claim to suzerainty over the region. Therefore, we must consider the capture of Bosporus in 575 the beginning of Khazar domination in these regions. This opinion would seem to be correct, because the sources do not mention the recapture of the Bosporus by the empire. The Khazars appear under their own name in Byzantine sources, for the first time in 626, when they concluded an alliance with the empire for common offense and defense against the Persians. This was during the times of Heraclius, when he fought a war against the Sassanid emperor Khosrau II, a war which ended the antiquity. Although most countries see the end of antiquity as fall of the Roman Empire in 476. The 7th century was for the Khazars a period of growing power and the formation of their state, which at the time lay between the lower course of Volga and Don, and extended southwards over the Caucasian plain. For the whole 7th century, the sources give no exact information on relation between the Khazars and the Crimea, but on basis of the account that just mentioned of their alliance with the empire in 626, we may state that certainly that before 630s, the Khazars opened no offensive policy against the peninsula, which was dependent upon Byzantium and to a certain extent its possessions. But somewhat later, the circumstances changed. How and why this happened, we do not know. But we are certain that late in the 7th century, the Khazars crossed the Cimmerian Strait, captured Bosporus, set up their governor there, and took possessions of a large section of the peninsula. As far as we may judge from the sources, which will be discussed below, the Khazars did not conquer the Gothic possessions. In the middle of the 7th century, Pope Martin I was exiled to Chersonesus. He landed there in May 654, and utterly worn out by his privations and sufferings, died in his place of exile 16th September 655. In two letters from Cherson, the exiled pope describes, perhaps as Vasilevsky remarks with some exaggeration, the desperate economic conditions on this Byzantine frontier. According to the pope, there was not even bread. Bread, he writes, is talked about but never seen. I knew that was coming and I still laughed. God damn it, bro. Even for a transitium, i.e., a third of one Byzantine gold solidus, he could not obtain it, only from small ships which came for salt at rare intervals from Romania, was he able to get a little bread and other provisions which barely kept him alive. I think that he might be exaggerating. There is no way it was that bad. I know the nomads are raiding around, but this is just silly on another level. If Martin's letters accurately reflect the situation, Dori, the Gothic region in Crimea, though according to Procopius' statement quoted above, abundant in the best fruits and inhabited by able cultivators, was apparently unable to relieve the economic crisis in nearby Chersonesus. This was probably because the mountainous aspect of the Gothic territory in the Crimea was not well suited for raising corn. In one of Martin's letters we read that inhabitants of this country are all pagans, and those who dwell there have also assumed pagan customs. They manifest not the slightest love for their neighbors, which is usually expressed in human nature, even among the barbarians, is the form of abundant compassion. In the connection with this passage, Saint Shekastkov remarks, the pagans mentioned by Martin usually mean the Goths first of all. Such was apparently Vasilevsky's opinion. Tomaszewsk and Lviv, I don't know if are those Slavic names or Greek names. They sound really weird they are pretty hard to read, so sorry for that. Express themselves more definitely on the subject. They find in Martin's statement a proof of predominance of the Gothic influence in the southwestern coastland of the Crimea in the 7th century. Saint Shekastov seems to be wrong in attributing this view to those scholars. V. Vasilevsky writes as follows: it is difficult to say whatever or not the neighboring Goths are meant here, who still maintain the superstitious worship of sacred trees as at the Palui. Tomaszewsk says, with regard to the passage under consideration, by contrast with the barbarians, the people living in the neighborhood of Cherson, that is, have grown savage. These statements of Vasilevsky and Tomaszewsk do not support Shekastkov's conclusions. Only in Lowy's book do we find some indication that in this case barbarians meant the Goths. Lowy points out that because of the remoteness from Byzantium and that the regions where the Greeks dwelt in thickly settled areas, the culture of Greek cities in Tauric coastland was so insignificant that it could exert no powerful influence upon the Gothic country folk, Bauernvolk. He then observes that we have information on this point in Martin's letter of complaint. Martin's letters about the pagans who lived in the neighborhood of Cherson certainly do not identify them with the Goths. At the time, the paganism was not a distinctive feature of the Goths, who, as we know, had long ago adopted Christianity. In my opinion, we must first allow for Martin's desire to present the living conditions of his exile in the darkest possible colors and admit his exaggeration. On the other hand, it is hardly possible that these heathens could have been the Khazars, who in the middle of the 7th century must still have been at some distance from the Chersonesus. If needed, they were in the peninsula at all. Possibly, there is also reference to the Goths in a scholium on the brief life of Theodore and Eparapius, which has been preserved in the Collectonia of Anastasius Bibliothecaricus. That's a pretty long name. That was a doozy. In the 9th century, we read here that Eparipius died about 655 AD and Theodore died about 667, who were exiled to the Cherson by Heraclius, where they're often separated by force and sent to the forts belonging to neighboring peoples. So we can see that the officials of the Byzantine or the Roman Empire speak very ill of the frontier region. Any frontier region, to be honest. If it's not a big city like Thessalonica, Nicaea, Constantinople, Athens, Alexandria, and of course Antioch, they usually see it as the worst place possible to be finding yourself in. We must understand that those peoples in power were not chosen by bureaucracy from the lower classes, like during the time of the good emperors. This is no longer the case. The bureaucracy is only there to fuel the imperial throne and, of course, the army. This is the only thing that matters for the Romans after the empire splits. It's more of a mafia rather than the bureaucratic empire. I'm trying to figure out the best word for it. Cartel, mafia, what are they? Because seat of the emperor switches often hands. There's not a family longer than 50 or 70 years on the throne. No dynasty holds it for longer than 200 years, basically. And those peoples are nobles, so they see every part of the empire that doesn't have a big administrative region that you can just sit in and control out of. You know, you have a Constantinople, so you control the entire empire out of Constantinople. You never leave Constantinople. Constantine the Great, who reconquered Rome with Basileus or Basileus. I don't remember how you're supposed to read it in English translation. I only remember the Greek translation. Guess what he did? Constantine never visited Rome that he retook. His dream was to restore Roman borders, and he never visited Rome. So if a Roman emperor, or that is official, that is noble, sees the Roman city as basically a shithole, and he never visits it, then why their opinion about placing Crimea such as Cherson would be different. I want to say that maybe Roman officials are not weak-minded people. Some of them know what they are doing, but they are just weak. They are pathetic with their thinking. What I am trying to say, they are accustomed to luxury, and when they leave that luxury, when they leave their beloved palace, their beloved city, they think it's a death sentence, and that's why they write such a really funny stuff. The bread part was funny, I gotta give it to him. Anyway, at the close of the 7th century, the beginning of the 8th, Crimean Goths took part in political events of the empire, the Popular Revolt, which burst out in Constantinople in 695, proclaimed Leontius emperor. Justinian II was dethroned, mutilated, and then exiled to Cherson. So we have another exile to Cherson. It's an imperial prison at this point. After the revolution in the capital, 698, when Leontius was dethroned and Absimar Tiberius raised to the throne, Justinian hoped to regain his power and spoke openly of his eventual restoration. The inhabitants of Cherson, fearing lest his recklessness should bring danger upon them from the ruling emperor, determined to either kill Justinian or to send him in chains to Absimar. Learning of this plan, Justinian fled the fortress Doras or Doras in Gothic territory, and hence asked the Khagan of the Khazars for permission to come to him. The Khagan granted permission, and Justinian went to his court. The Khagan received him with honor, married him to his own sister, upon whom, after baptism, the name of Theodora was bestowed, and then assigned the capital to the city of Panagoria, which lay on the eastern shore of Cimmerian Bosporus. That would be like under Azov, the city of Azov in modern-day Russia. I am not quite sure where that would be, so sorry for that. Informed of Justinian's friendly relations with the Khagan, Absimar Tiberius opened negotiations with the latter. He promised him rich presents if he would deliver up Justinian, living or dead. The Khagan was inclined to comply with emperor's overtures. First of all, he surrounded Justinian with Khazar guard under the pretext of protecting him from the danger from Byzantium, but in reality to prevent his escape. And then he gave instructions to the governor of Panagoria, Papazzi, that's a very Italian-sounding name, and the governor of Bosporus, Balcuzzi, to kill Justinian on the receipt of specific orders. Theodora, informed of her brother's plans by one of the Kagan's slaves, warned Justinian. He sent his wife to Caesarea and then secretly escaped from Panagoria. Boarding a ship, he sailed along the southern coast of the Crimea. On his way, he stopped at the port of Cymbolon near Cherson and secretly asked some of his adherents from Cherson to join him. Then he rounded the lighthouse of Cherson and, passing by the Dnieper and the Dniester, reached the Danube. There he came to an agreement with the Khan of Bulgaria, Terbel, and, supported by the Bulgarians, advanced upon the capital and in 705 regained the throne. Desirous of revenge for the plots which during his stay in Tauris the inhabitants of Cherson, Bosporus, and the other Climata has formed against him, Justinian sent a huge fleet to Cherson with the orders to slay the population of those regions and apparently to send to the capital the members of the chief Chersonesians' families. One of these ships carried the Spacharius Elias, who was appointed governor of Cherson. On arriving, the imperial troop, without meeting any resistance, captured the fortified cities and put the most population to the sword. But the Kagan's viceroy at Cherson, whose title was Tudun, as well as Zoilus, the first citizen of Cherson, and 40 other prominent citizens were sent in chains to the capital. A considerable number of other well-known men were cruelly tortured before execution. The emperor commanded the fleet to return to the capital. On these ships were the children who, in spite of emperor's orders, were left alive and reserved for slavery. On his return voyage, the fleet was almost entirely destroyed by a storm. The sources give a figure, certainly exaggerated, of those who perished, about 73,000 men. So here we have a story of a half-Gothic emperor, I presume, who usurped Constantine. Then Constantine doesn't like that he's exiled and he allies himself with the Khazars. Then he moves from Caesarea because Khazars want to betray him into Bulgaria, and with the Bulgars he reclaimed his throne. I guess the Constantinian, that's how you say it, population must have thrown open the gates for his horde of nomads and for him to allow just, entry to the city. It's it is the most guarded city in the world at this point, except of course China. So that they must have opened the door just for him. And all of that is plausible. What the part that isn't plausible is this biblical ending tale where his wrath dooms his expedition to Cherson because he didn't like his stay in Cherson, so he sends the army to kill the Cherson population. Bro, they can't just have a break in the Cherson, I must tell you that. That place sucks, and now they're getting even killed by their own people. After his imperial army slaughters the citizens of Cherson, they travel back on their ships and they are sunk by a storm. And this is the part that it's hard to believe. It sounds really biblical. Because stories from Bible are like this, that you take a bad action and it gets punished by God or by your actions alone. And this is what, few scholars don't want to agree that this even happened. I bet he did send someone to, capture Cherson. Maybe Cherson was supporting, putting him in chains and sending him back to Constantinople to the Gothic emperor so he could torture him to death, I presume. So he would just wanted revenge for this. But we got to remember that the people of Cherson, the notables of Cherson, did this because if they didn't do it, then the actual emperor would show up and kill them. So they just did this out of their duty or just being scared of retaliation from the emperor. This disaster not only did not afflict Justinian, as Theophanes and Nicephorus write, but filled him with great joy. As Bury remarks, the emperor seems to have become really insane. All this, however, did not satisfy Justinian, who threatened to send another fleet to Cherson with orders to raze all buildings to the ground and to plow the soil left after the destruction. So you can see here that the nomad influence here, that he speaks of destroying a city and plowing over the remains. That's a nomad thing, because Genghis Khan, in his speech at Otrar in a mosque, it was I am the scourge of God speech at Otrar. He remarks that he will destroy their cities and plow over their land to become grazing land for his horses. And here is the same thing. This Khazar influence over the Justinian is just flowing out of him now. But the inhabitants of the fortified places, which had incurred the emperor's rage, appealed to the Khazar Khagan for troops to protect them. At the same time, Elias, who had recently been appointed governor of Cherson, and Vardan, who had been exiled there, rose against the emperor. On learning of this revolt, Justinian sent in few military vessels, dromons, those were the name of the ships, 300 armed men, headed by the patrician and legate George, surnamed the Syrian, a very high official, eparch prefect John, and the trumarch of the Circassian troops, Christophorus. Along with them were sent back to Cherson the Tudun of the Khazar Khagan and Propolite of Cherson Zolius, who had been mentioned above. They had been brought off to Justinian from Cherson. Now they were sent back to take their former position as governors. A special imperial envoy was to apologize to the Khagan for what had happened. Justinian wanted Elias and Vardan, who had revolted against him, to be brought to the capital. The Chersonesians, however, would not come to any agreement with the imperial envoys, and disposed of the expedition in the following manner. On the arrival of the imperial navy, the Chersonesians immediately put to death the legate George and the eparch John, and through Khazars sent the Tudun, Zolius, the trumarch Christophorus, and 300 armed men to the Khagan. The Tudun died on the way. The rest of the company were killed by the Khazars. Cherson and other towns of Peninsula thus succeeded from Justinian, proclaimed the above-mentioned Vardan emperor under the name of Philippicus. Beside him, with rage, Justinian prepared a new armament under the command of Marus the patrician, who was abundantly provided with different sorts of siege machinery. Marus was ordered not only to destroy the walls of Cherson, but also to raze to the ground the whole city and to spare not a soul in it. On arriving at his destination, Maurus laid a siege to the town. 2 towers collapsed under the blows of his engineers. But with this, the success of the Byzantine arms ceased. The Khazars who had arrived at the town compelled Maurus to suspend hostilities. Then the unsuccessful army, afraid to return, deserted Justinian and embraced the cause of Vardan Philippicus, who at the time was staying at the Khagan's court. So yeah, this fragment, for those who said that medieval Total Wars 2 AI is bad and why their generals just switched to rebel, yeah, all of this is historical. This whole segment, it's real. Okay, let's be serious for a moment. What we can see here is Cherson is some kind of a magical cursed land that whenever you send somebody there, it switches sides. And I have a reason for that, because there is a Khagan's army there. I mean, if you're a Roman emperor's general and he sends you to pacify a town, it's fine. I can do it. I have 3,000 men, I have some engineers, I have siege engines. Awesome. I can kill anybody I want. I mean, emperor wants. But then the same size army nomads show up. Maybe even more. 4,000, 6,000 just nomads on horseback show up to kill you. And when it says in the text he was compelled by the Khazars to cease hostilities, you should read it as he was scared shitless and he did not want to fight a nomadic host and switch sides. That's what happened, basically, because if he did, he would have been wiped out. That's what would have happened anyway. The nomads would have won and the Cherson would have prevailed anyway. Maurus and his troops asked the Khagan to bring the new emperor to them, but evidently fearing for Vardan's safety, the Khagan surrendered him only after having received from Maris's troops a large security in money. In 711, with the new emperor at its head, the army sailed towards Constantinople, where Philippicus was received by the population without a blow being struck. Justinian was assassinated, and the capital proclaimed Vardan Philippicus emperor. This was Emperor Philippicus Vardan Bardanes, who reigned from 711 to 713. All this drama for 2 years of reign. This is the most Byzantine thing ever. Now let us draw from this account the data preceding to the Gothic and Khazar question in Crimea. We shall begin with the 10 years of Justinian's exile, i.e. from 695 to 705. Cherson at the time belonged to the Empire, and as formerly was serving as a place of exile for the most dangerous and prominent enemies of the Empire. Hence, Justinian's flight from here to Doris, or Doras, Dori, according to Procopius, i.e., to the chief center of the Gothic settlement in Tauris, shows that at the time this section of mountain Crimea had slipped away from the suzerainty of Byzantium and enjoyed independence. As Savielski wrote, this was sort of a neutral territory in which Justinian was inaccessible to the direct attempts of Byzantine authorities, and at the same time was not yet under the power of the Khazar Khagan. The towns which depended upon the Khazars were governed by the Khagan's Visars, or viceroys. Thus, in the opening years of the 8th century, the eastern and, as we shall see, presently, the northern and southwestern sections of the peninsula up to Cherson, i.e., the major part of the Crimean steppe, were in the power of the Khazars. The flight of Justinian has usually been referred to 704. The southern coast, its mountain section, at least seems not have belonged to the Khazars. For that time, we possesses reliable evidence concerning the Byzantine power in southwestern section of Crimea, namely at Symbolon, Bakalava, and Cherson. The evidence of chronicles regarding Justinian's punitive expeditions against Cherson shows us the Khazar successes in Crimea, which evidently took place in the first decade of the 8th century, when about 710 and an imperial army arrived at Cherson. It found in the city a Khazar governor, the Tudun, as well as the representative of the city, the Propolite Zolius. It is very probable that the advance of the Khazars to the Cherson occurred in connection with Justinian's flight from there to Doras. His appeal for help to Khagan and the strained relations between the Khazars and the empire, which must inevitably have appeared as a result of these political complications. Also, I forgot to mention that Tudun means king in, of course, the Turkic language. Although it could also mean keeper or holder. It's basically a title of governance in the nomadic hosts. Such was, used here by the Khazars, but it was also used by the Timurids, holder of Samarkand, Tudun of Samarkand, for example. Okay, let's get back to the punitive expedition sent by Justinian to the Crimea. Easily obtained the mastery over the rebellious towns. It is hardly to be supposed that the imperial troops captured all the cities and regions mentioned in the sources which had rebelled against Justinian, i.e. Cherson, Bosporus, and the other Climata. The latter apparently comprised the Gothic possessions in Crimea, which are often given this name. But some of them, including Cherson, passed into the emperor's hands, and the captured Tudun and Propolite were carried to Constantinople. On learning that new expedition was being prepared against Cherson, its governor Elias, who had been sent there by the emperor, and Vardan, who had been exiled there, revolted against Justinian and the regents, who had just returned to the imperial power, asked the Khagan for protection. Shortly after, Vardan, who at the time was at the Khagan's court, was proclaimed emperor in Cherson and in some other places which belonged to the empire. We have thus proof of very interesting fact that the Khazars were allied with the Greek possessions in the Crimea against the emperor. Obviously, many of these events took place in the territory of Crimean Goths, about 700. When Justinian fled from Cherson to Doros to the Goths, the Gothic possessions in Crimea, so-called Gothic Kilimata, took advantage of the external difficulties of the empire to free themselves from their allied and vassal relationship with the Byzantium, which, as we know, had been established under Justinian the Great in the 6th century. At the outers of the 8th century, in its relations with Justinian II, Crimean Goths was acting with Cherson and the Khazars. According to the sources, the Kilimata were hostile to the emperor. The Khazars occupied the steppe regions of the peninsula early in the 8th century, but they failed to possess mountain Goths. The conquest of Doros by the Khazars took place later, at the end of the 8th century. The Khagan's friendly relations with the empire prevented him from further occupation of the peninsula. These relations are to be explained by the Arabian danger, which in the 8th century menaced the vital interest both of the empire and the Khaganate. Throughout all the 8th century, these two states were stubbornly fighting against the Mohammedans, while in the far west the Frankish majordomus of the Charles Martel at their head were defending Western Europe against the Arabs who were advancing from beyond the Pyrenees, and the emperors of the Isaurian house were driving them back from the walls of Constantinople and carrying an energetic war against them in Asia Minor. The Khazars at the same time were vigorously fighting with the Mohammedans in Caucasus, finally preventing them from crossing Caucasian range and spreading over the Caucasian steppes north of the mountains. In 732, the Khazaro-Byzantine alliance was sealed by marriage of Constantine, son and heir of Leo IV the Isaurian, with the daughter of the Khazar Khagan, who took the Christian name Irene. This son of Leo III was the future iconoclastic emperor Constantine V Copronymus. The iconoclastic movement of the 8th century in the Byzantium vigorously affected the Crimean Peninsula in general and Crimean Goths in particular. During the reign of Leo III, the iconoclastic tendencies of the government were only beginning to make themselves felt, but his successor, Constantine V Copronymus, was a real iconoclastic leader. Accordingly, many representatives of the clergy determined not to submit to his policy, wishing to preserve intact the dogmas of the Orthodox iconoclastic faith. They preferred voluntary exile and left the regions of the empire where iconoclasm was prevalent. It is known that the iconoclastic tendencies of the Isaurian emperors were not accepted all over the empire. On this subject, we have interesting data in the life of Stephen the Younger, who lived in the 8th century. He died in 764, November 28th. According to the life, monks and hermits, dwellers of caves, and inhabitants of mountains streamed to the saint, who had fled for refuge to the mountains of Asia Minor, and begged him to instruct and console them in their calamity. Stephen advised them to seek refuge in those regions of Europe which were not affected by iconoclastic movement, or, in words of life, were not under the power of the dragon and sharing his error. 3 such regions were the first, northern shores of Exwain, its coast regions towards the eparchy of Zikria, and territory from Bosporus, Cherson, and Nicopolis towards Lower Gothia. Secondly, southern Italy, and thirdly, the south of Asia Minor, Cyprus, and the coast of Syria and Palestine. Persecuted monks were proceeded to these 3 asylums. According to the life, Byzantium was empty of monks because of all of them had been brought into captivity. Some sailed to the Euxine, others fled to the island of Cyprus, and others were planning to go to Rome. The fact of a large emigration of Byzantine monks to Italy is very well known and has many times been duly estimated in history of southern Italian Hellenism in Middle Ages. For our purpose, the information of the life on the analogous emigration of the persecuted Byzantine monks to the Tauric Peninsula through Cherson, Bosporus, and Gothia is extremely important and interesting. a fact which has not been noted by the Byzantine chroniclers. This is doubtless a very important cultural phenomenon in the history of the medieval Crimea, for it indicates the increase of the Hellenic element in the peninsula, the origin of the rock-cut churches and monasteries in various places in the Crimean mountains, the remains of which have survived down to the present day, is in all likelihood to be referred to the epoch of emigration of the monks in the 8th century. Examples of these cave dwellings can be noted also in the territory of Crimean Goths. These monuments may be compared with analogous monuments in southern Italy, and their study in connection with the general epoch of iconoclasm is of great interest and one of important problems of the cultural history of Byzantium in general and of the medieval Crimea in particular. The Bishop of Gothia, John's predecessor, whose name is unknown, participated in the meetings of the Iconoclastic Council of 753 to 754 and gave his signature to its decrees. In recognition, he was transferred by Constantine V from the Gothic borderland as Metropolite of Heraclea of Thrace near Constantinople. The Crimean Goths remained faithful to orthodoxy and did not wish to take part in novelties of the lawless council. Accordingly, they elected John, and the election must have taken place soon after the council of 753, i.e. about 755. John's family originally came from the northern coast of Asia Minor, whence his grandfather, after the completion of his military service, emigrated to Crimea. John's parents, Leo and Photiana, were natives of Gothia. John's birthplace was Partheniate, the present-day Tatar village Parthenit, a trading place or mart which was subject to the Goths on the southern coast of the Crimea, at the foot of Ayabdah. From the point of view of the author of the life, who lived, as has been noted above, in Asia Minor, John's birthplace was the land of Tauroscythians, situated on the other side of the sea. John proceeded to Jerusalem, where he spent 3 years, and then after visiting the holy places returned to Gothia. Then, since the Patriarch of Constantinople, who had adopted the erroneous path of iconoclasm, could not ordain an orthodox bishop, the inhabitants of Gothia sent John to Iberia, i.e. Georgia, to the Archbishop Catholikios, there who ordained him bishop. Thus John, who was ordained bishop of Gothia by Archbishop Catholicos of Georgia, whose residence at the time was Mazaket, near Tiflis. We have stated above that the election of John as bishop of Gothia took place about 755, taking into consideration his 3-year stay in Palestine before his ordination at Mizket. We may refer to this ordination probably to 759. John remained as bishop in Gothia for a long time, according to the life, after the death of Emperors Constantine V, 775, and Leo IV, the Khazars, 780, when the latter's son Constantine VI, a minor, and his mother Irene, the future restorer of the veneration of icons, had begun to rule. John sent to Constantinople to Patriarch Paul IV, 780 to 784, a decree of Council of Jerusalem on the adoration of holy icons and relics, which was sent to Gothia soon after his ordination. What this text tells us is that Gothia remained an Orthodox island, literally and metaphorically, of course, where the worship of the icons still remained active and intact. Gothia also had many notables from around the empire, especially the monks or our archbishop here, that is extensively written about. People also often forget why iconoclasm happened, and because, well, it happened because of winning battles against Muslims. Well, you see, Isaurians, a dynasty which spread this whole iconoclasm, were fighting Muslims. And they thought to themselves, Muslims are winning battles because they banned images of God. So they did that themselves. And when they started winning battles against the Muslims after doing that, something clicked in them. To be honest, those times, it's all about God. Everything is about God. You do not take a step without thinking about God. So when you win a battle, after assuming to make a religious breakthrough, that is, You shall not make any graven image. That was one of the commandments. So when they stopped making what they saw, what they thought to be graven images, and they started winning battles against Muslims, they just adopted that path for their religion. And they just banned use of icons until Irene, of course, brought them back. Now we're going to jump in history a bit after the Magyar invasion into Pannonia and the spread of Pechenegs on the Khazar steppe. And of course, let's not forget the Rus, which we are going to be reading about here, which started conquering a realm for themselves and became a prominent player in the region. Therefore, we must turn to the attacks of the Russians in the first half of the 9th century. According to the life of Stefan of Surosh, which so far is known only as an old Russian version, in the first quarter of the 9th century, a Russian prince Bravlin invaded the Crimea. A few years after the death of Saint, a huge Russian army under a very powerful Prince Bravlin came from Novgorod. He took possession of the land from Cherson, Korsun to Kerch. Then with great force he came to Surosh. After 10 days of valiant fighting, Bravlin forced the Iron Gate and entered the city. Then he entered the church of Saint Sophia and breaking down the door entered the place where stood the coffin of the saint. On the coffin there are royal shrouds, pearls, gold, precious stones, golden candles and many golden vessels. And he stole everything. What's new about Russians, huh? Then follows the story of miraculous baptism of Bravlin and his nobles, boyars. From this account we learn that Bravlin returned the sacred vessels he had taken in Surosh, Cherson, Kerch and other places, as well the captives, men, women and the children taken from Cherson to Kerch. Here we have a very interesting fact of an attack on Crimea by the Russians, who devastated the coastline between Cherson and Kerch, took possession of Surosh, and seized many captives and much rich booty. On good grounds, this is ascribed to first 25 years of the 9th century. From the evidence of life to be concluded that such an important fortified centers as Cherson and Kerch were also captured by the Russians. But, however, that many have been, the major part of the peninsula suffered severely from this predatory campaign. Here then, in the new and unexpected danger which menaced Khazaria and Crimea, Khazaria and Byzantium were compelled to make energetic measures against Russian attacks, which, beginning with the first 25 years of the 9th century, from that time on made themselves felt along the coast of the Black Sea. By the 30s of this century, the Russian danger was already a real fact to be reckoned with. I have apparently somewhat deviated from the Gothic problem in the Crimea, but I believe that the facts just discussed refer directly to the Crimean Goths. The Russian raids into Crimea, which devastated the territory between Cherson and Kerch and resulted in the capture of Surosh, could hardly have failed to affect the Gothic regions. In spite of the lack of exact evidence on the subject, we may suppose that the Gothic territory in Crimea was also devastated and pillaged. This was the first contact between the Crimean Goths and the Russians. In the 10th century, as we shall see later, they came to a friendly understanding in order to get rid of the Khazar danger. It is quite possible that the first strategos of Climata, i.e. of the Chersonesian theme, Petronas Kamateras, with the acquaintance of the Khazar authorities in Crimea, was entrusted among other tasks with protecting the Crimean Goths against Russian inroads. At Cherson, he was notified that the Khazar governor had laid siege to one of the small cities in the neighborhood. Constantine went to a governor and by his preaching and instruction persuaded him to raise the siege and refrain from harming the Christian population of the city. On his way back to the Cherson, Constantine was attacked by the Magyars, who, howling like wolves, threatened to kill him, but when they saw him continue to pray, they were calmed by the will of the god, did reverence to him, and let him go unharmed with all his companions. Probably this attack of the Magyar horde took place somewhere in the steppe regions of the Crimea, areas easily accessible to the predatory raids of the Magyar horsemen. I have given this account because Bury, though without any good reason, supposed that the incident occurred on Gothic territory. In the Pannonian life of the Constantine, there are two other passages which are often referred to the Crimean Goths. In one place, the life relates that on coming to Cherson, Constantine found there a gospel and a psalter which were written in Russian characters, and met a man who spoke that language. Constantine talked to the man, learned that new language, and was soon able to read and interpret the text. After Constantine's life was published, heated disputes arose among the scholars on the subject of the writing of the gospel and the psalter referred to. While some scholars have considered this passage a later interpolation, others have entertained no doubt that it was genuine. As to the language, scholars were at variance. Most of them believed that the Russian characters meant the Gothic language. Some were inclined to see the Russian language, either that of Azovo-Turkmenan, Rus, or that of Kiev. Finally, some were of opinion that the passage dealt with the Alan language, and that the Russian mentioned in the life was an Alan. More recently, scholars have returned to the Gothic theory and asserted that the Gospel found by Constantine at Cherson was written in Gothic, in the alphabet established by Ulfila. In the same life, another account occurs, which without good reason is sometimes connected with the Crimean Goths. During his stay at the Crimea, Constantine learned that the people of Paluli had an enormous oak near which they made pagan sacrifices. Constantine went to them and persuaded them to cut down the oak, root up the stump, and burn it. Of course, we deal here with the city of Paluli, which was already been mentioned in the life of John of Gothia and the Notitia published by C. de Boer. Setting aside the questions of reliability of this account of Constantine, I will note that Vasilevsky wrote on this point the fact that in spite of Christian faith, in the second half of 9th century, pagan rites continued to be performed here, and that these superstitious customs were manifested in the worship of an oak, will in no wise contradict the hypothesis that the people of Paluli belong to the Goths. Hence, it is obvious that aside from the mere mentions of the Goths among the other peoples given in the description of the discussion at Venice, to the Pannonian life of Constantine gives no evidence on Crimean Goths. Some hypotheses concerning the Crimean Goths have also been made in connection with the obscure questions of the conversion of the Russians under the Patriarch Photius in the 60s of the 9th century, i.e. a few years after the first attack on Constantinople by Russians, 18th June 1860. In his circular letter of 867, Photius wrote that the cruel and murderous Russians had turned to the Christianity and accepted a bishop and a shepherd. At a loss, like many other scholars, as to who these Russians were, Vasilevsky was inclined to identify them with previous to the middle of the 9th century Tauroscythians, whom he identified with the Goths, Valan Goths or Gothalans. Knowing, of course, that the Crimean Goths had been Christians for a long time, he supposed that somewhere north of Cherson there might have been also some pagan Goths, but it goes without saying that Vasilevsky's hypothesis has no serious basis whatsoever. What is up with Russian scholars and just making shit up? Like, it continues from like 1800s to like modern times. It's insane to me. What is in heads of those people? Late in the 9th century, as has been noted above, the Patsnikas, Pechenegs, who had come from the east, settled in the steppes south of Russia, gradually spreading, they penetrated into the Crimea, so that some decades later, about 950, Constantine Progenitus wrote that the following interesting lines: the Patsnikas occupy the whole country of Russia, and the Bosporus as far as Cherson, Seref, Proof, and the 30 regions. Hence, it is obvious that in the first half of the century, the Patsnikas were already occupying considerable portion of the Crimean plain, and were to a certain extent menacing the Crimean Goths. This supposition is fully confirmed by another passage of the same work, where Constantine remarks, "This people of Patsnikas border us upon the regions of Cherson, and if we are not on a friendly footing with them, they can march on Cherson and raid and devastate both Cherson itself and the so-called Climata," according to a letter of Patriarch Nicholas Mysticius to the Archbishop of Bulgaria at the beginning of the 10th century, during the war between Byzantium and Bulgaria. The strategos of Cherson, John Bogas, many times called the attention of the imperial government to the fact that the Bulgars, Pechenegs, and some other peoples who dwelt in those regions were actively preparing to make war on the empire and invade its territory. This shows once more the growing might and importance of the Pechenegs in the north. I hesitate to admit that the Crimean Goths are included among some other peoples who dwelt in those regions. The growing power of the Pechenegs in the Crimea meant corresponding decline and finally the collapse of the Khazar predominance in the peninsula. Receding eastwards, the Khazars were forced gradually to evacuate the territory which they had been occupying for a long time. At the opening of the 10th century, the period of Khazar predominance in the Crimea came to an end. We must not lose sight of the fact that the decline of the Khazar influence in Crimea was also due partially to the clever diplomacy of the Byzantine government. As long as it was profitable to Byzantium, had maintained friendly relations with the Khazars, but she rapidly realized the change which was occurring in Crimea and adequately estimated the growing importance of the Pechenegs there. While the Khazar predominance in Crimea was diminishing, the Crimean Goths were gradually freeing themselves from the Khazar power and were once again coming under the power of Byzantium. Towards the middle of the 10th century, the restoration of the power of the empire over Gothia was an accomplished and very well-known fact. In the first half of the 10th century, the Russian danger began to make itself very strongly felt. The text of the treaty concluded in 945 between the Russian Prince Igor and the Byzantine Emperor, which has survived in the Russian annals, gives us very interesting confirmation of this statement. After the failure of Igor's campaign against Constantinople, among other conditions of the Treaty of Peace, would read the following: in the matter of the country of Cherson and all the cities in that region, the Prince of Rus shall not have the right to make war in these localities, nor shall that district be subject to him. It is obvious that this point was included in the text of the treaty because Cherson and the cities in that region had before undergone Russian attacks. Unfortunately, the Greek originals of the treaties between the first Russian princes and Byzantium are unknown. Therefore, it is impossible to be certain of the original version, but we may say with certainty that the Russian word "chasti" portion or section, the cities in that region, an English translation, which occurs in the Russian annals, is rendering of the Greek word epos. I'm sorry, it's actually written in Greek, so I don't know how to read this, which is used by Constantine Paphraganitos. If this is so, we are justified on the basis of Igor's Treaty of 945, in drawing the conclusion that in the first half of the 10th century, the Gothic regions of Crimea, the so-called Climata, suffered Russian raids, and that the Treaty of 945, which was dedicated by victorious side, i.e. by Byzantium, obligated Igor henceforth to put an end to such aggressions. Accordingly to the treaty, so be it good that the great Prince Igor that shall rightly maintain those friendly relations, that they may never be interrupted as long as the sun shines and the world endures henceforth and forevermore. It is not surprising that during this period, Byzantine influence in Crimea was in a state of decline, and this people, who at the time were playing an important role in South Russia, took advantage of these difficulties. It should be remembered, however, that the importance of empire's relations with the northern peoples was theoretically fully recognized by the imperial government. We know that in the middle of the 10th century, Constantine Paphraganitos, who was unable to take measures he wished in the north in his work on the administration of the empire, gave his son and heir several thoughtful and wise pieces of advice as to which policy should be followed towards the barbarians who dwelt on the northern shore of the Black Sea. The decline of the Byzantine power in Crimea affected the position of Crimean Goths. The treaty with Igor in 945 seemed to have re-established the imperial power, obligating the Russian prince to cease further attacks on the Gothic Climata. This paragraph of the treaty was imposed by Igor by the victory of Byzantium over him. But owing to the general conditions noted above, the empire, after 945, was unable to enforce this clause of the treaty. In other words, it could not succor efficiently in the case of need. Cherson and the Gothic Climata, Crimean Goths, left to its fate, was forced to defend its own interests. Such was the situation in Crimea towards the opening of the 60s of the 10th century. I think everything that I read you so far is straightforward and doesn't need explaining, but now I'm gonna read you a story from that time of a Hellenized Goth who lived in those times. The story itself is not meant to be taken seriously, like 100% of it, but it is a historical record and we have to accept it as one. The story is told in the first person, sometimes plural, sometimes singular, i.e., from our point of view, either from the name of Crimean Goth, or better, of the population of Crimean Goths, or directly in the name of the toparch himself. The story begins with the decision of the Crimean Goths to anticipate a barbarian attack by attacking first. The fragment gives the following description of these unnamed barbarians. They most cruelly ruined and destroyed all, like wild beasts, raging in every way. Ferociously and cautiously, they decided to make the country a prey to the Mysians, i.e., to raze everything to the ground. The former mindedness and justice of these barbarians had allowed them to attain the greatest triumphs. Cities and peoples had willingly joined them, but then they revealed injustice and despotism towards their subjects. They determined to enslave and destroy their subject cities instead of supporting and aiding them. Innocent chiefs could not escape death. In the regions bordering on Gothia, more than 10 cities and no less than 500 villages had been totally deserted. Innocent people, protected by oaths, had fallen a prey to the hands and swords. Finally, fate brought these barbarians to the region of Toparch, who took energetic steps to avert this serious danger. The war between the Toparch and the barbarians broke out without formal declaration, when winter was near at hand, because the sun was already not far from the winter, that is, late in the autumn. The barbarians, with large number of horse and foot, plundered and devastated the Toparch's regions, and razed to the ground the walls of his chief city, so that his subjects were forced to dwell in and make out sallies from the destroyed city, which was little better than a village. But in spite of this, the Toparch, opposing archers to the barbarian foot and cavalry to their horse, forced them towards night to retreat. Afterwards, he determined to repopulate the Climata. For this purpose, he built a fort, planning from this starting point to rebuild the whole city. Here the second fragment ends. The third fragment, chronologically the second, opens with the account of the rapid construction of the fort and the surrounding moat. The most important possessions were stored in the fort, and everything else somewhere outside, in another enclosure of the city. The barbarians apparently withdrew and at least temporarily gave up the war. For more than 100 rides and 300 slingers and archers whom the Toparch led out of the battle were unable to discover their enemy. Taking advantage of this interval in hostilities, the Toparch set to work to restore the old wall and to prepare his troops for future warfare. At the same time, he sent messengers to the adherents. Coming from all quarters, they held a meeting of nobles called in the text best men. The Toparch, foreseeing future complications with the barbarians, proposed that they should consider which ruler they should first approach in order to profit as much as possible. Either because they had never enjoyed the imperial favor and were not influenced by Greek customs, and first of all sought autonomy, or because they were neighbors of the ruler north of Danube, who possessed a strong army and was proud of his military forces, and from whose people they did not differ in customs and manners. They determined to make a treaty with him and surrender to him, and they unanimously decided that I should do the same. The Toparch went to the northern ruler and briefly explained the cause of his coming. Much struck with importance of the matter, the ruler willingly reinstated the Toparch in his authority over the Climata, added one satrapy more, and granted him annual revenues from the ruler's own country. You might think, why did he act so generously? Well, because Crimea is a connection between the Middle East and, well, let's say Europe. Same as Constantinople. A lot of trade flows through there. And owning that strategic position, he just struck gold without doing nothing. It's like Steam nowadays, you know? Like everybody accuses them of being a monopoly. They do nothing and they win. That's literally the Kievan Rus at this point. We must also remember that this protectorate over Gothia was very short-lived. It only lasted 10 years from 962 to 972. Yes, the Pechenegs, or unnamed barbarians, were stopped, but, Byzantine politics played a role, and they could have just halted the whole trade. Possibility. We don't know if that's the case or they couldn't hold it. But Prince Sviatoslav, which was ruling at the time, did not hold Crimea for a very long time. Although a decade is a fair amount of time, to be honest. But because of this, it led Russian princes on this way of war, which lasts to this day. Russia really wants that warm port in Crimea. They claimed Crimea for themselves, and they saw it as their land now, basically. But Crimea slipped back into the Byzantine hands again after they couldn't hold it. So what happened is they started fighting the Byzantines over that land, such as we have Prince Vladimir. And I'm gonna read you a following statement. Vladimir halted in the harbor on the further side of the city. The basis of this rather vague passage and some other considerations, most scholars have recently come to a conclusion, which in my opinion is correct, that Vladimir undertook this campaign by water. He went down to the Dnieper by the usual Greek way and then sailed along the shores of the Crimea. Vladimir possessed Cherson for a short while. According to the Russian chronicle, when he married the Byzantine princess, as the wedding present for the princess, he gave Cherson over to the Greeks again, and then departed for Kiev. So yeah, he waged war for the city he wanted, and then was bribed by with a woman, which is really funny. Like former Russian naval enterprises, Vladimir's naval campaign against Cherson aimed at no vast offensive results. I agree with those scholars who asserted that Vladimir soon surrendered Cherson because he had no need whatsoever of this city, and was absolutely unable to keep it. Vladimir did not even reach to the territory of Gothic Crimea. I have lingered over this episode because some scholars declare that during this campaign Vladimir revived again old claims to the Tauric ports and Cherson and Crimea. Alright, I'm gonna stop the video here because it's over an hour long. Yeah, maybe there's gonna be a part 2 because we just arrived at the Cuban arrival to Europe. So yeah, it is a pretty long reading. So we're gonna see about that. Probably because I already have the book, so why wouldn't I continue? But anyway, thank you for watching and see you in the next one.